To the old lady who won't let go of Dad's house. My son Daniel slurred into his wine glass on the night of my 86th birthday, and the room filled with a laughter that didn't quite know where to land. I remember the way the chandelier light reflected off the crystal stem in my hand, steady, unshaken, even though something inside me shifted quietly and permanently in that moment. The restaurant was one of those upscale steakhouses along the harbor in Boston, the kind with dark wood walls and leather chairs that swallow you whole, and I had chosen it because Edward used to love their prime rib, slow-roasted for 8 hours, and served with creamed spinach just the way he liked it. I wore a navy silk dress and the pearl necklace he gave me on our 40th anniversary, the clasp still firm after all these years, unlike so many other things in my life. My grandchildren sat across from me, their phones lighting up their faces in pale blue glows, while Laura, my daughter-in-law, watched Daniel with a tight smile that never quite reached her eyes. I had spent the afternoon having my hair set, tipping the stylist $20 more than usual, because she told me 86 was something to celebrate, and I believed her. I believed that age meant honor. I believed that motherhood meant loyalty. I believed that a son raised in the same house for 30 years would understand what those walls held. When Daniel stood to make his toast, I expected something sentimental, maybe even awkward, but kind. Instead, he leaned slightly against the table, the scent of bourbon drifting across the linen, and delivered his joke as if I were a stubborn piece of furniture refusing to be moved. No one corrected him. No one said, "That's enough." They just sipped their wine. I smiled because dignity is a habit you practice for decades, and I had practiced well. I even lifted my glass in return and said, "Thank you, sweetheart." My voice calm, measured, almost light. Inside, though, I replayed the conversation from 48 hours earlier when Laura had called asking about paperwork, in a tone too casual to be innocent. I remembered Daniel standing in my hallway last month, glancing toward the study where Edward kept the deed in a fireproof box, as if the house were already halfway his. They think I'm holding on, I realized. They think I'm clinging to square footage and hardwood floors and a view of the Atlantic that stretches 5 miles on a clear day. But the house is not about shingles or property taxes. It is about promises made across a kitchen table in 1974. It is about raising a boy through chickenpox and algebra and heartbreak. It is about a man who once told me, "No one will ever make you feel small in your own home." As the waiter refilled our water glasses, condensation sliding down the sides like quiet tears, I understood something with a clarity sharper than Daniel's careless joke. They were not celebrating my birthday. They were measuring my expiration date. And I decided, right there between the prime rib and the molten chocolate cake, that I would let them think I was just an old woman clinging to memories. Because sometimes the most powerful move is not the one you announce at the table, but the one you prepare in silence the next morning. The morning after my birthday dinner, I woke up at 5:30 the way I always do, before the sun rises over the Atlantic, before the traffic begins its steady hum along the main road, before the world remembers that it is in a hurry. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles deep into the floorboards of a place that has stood for nearly 50 years. I slipped on my wool cardigan and walked down the hallway, my hand brushing against the framed photographs that line the wall. Daniel at 6 years old with a missing front tooth. Daniel at 16 holding the keys to his first used sedan. Daniel at 30 standing beside Laura on their wedding day. All of them taken inside this very house. I brewed my coffee the way Edward taught me. 2 level tablespoons for every 6 ounces of water, no shortcuts, no flimsy pods, and I stood at the kitchen window watching the tide roll in. From here you can see nearly 5 miles out on a clear morning, the water stretching wide and patient, and I wondered how something so steady could be mistaken for stubbornness. Daniel believes I will not let go. Laura believes I am clinging to the past. But what they do not understand is that I have already let go of far more important things than square footage. I let go of sleep when Daniel had fevers that would not break. I let go of my own career when Edward and I decided one of us should stay home. I let go of Edward himself 3 years ago when the hospital room felt too small for the goodbye we had to say. The house is not a trophy. It is not an investment property. It is the last place where Edward's laughter still echoes in the corners. As I carried my coffee into the study, I noticed something small but telling. The fireproof document box was not positioned exactly where I left it. It was only an inch or 2 off center on the shelf, but I am 86 years old, not unaware. Daniel had stopped by 2 weeks ago under the pretense of fixing a loose cabinet hinge. Laura had lingered in the hallway longer than necessary. They had asked about the deed, about the property taxes, about whether I had considered the rising maintenance costs of a house that measures 3,000 square feet. Their words had been careful, polite, but underneath them was a quiet urgency. Sell now, before it becomes a burden. Move somewhere smaller, somewhere managed, somewhere easier. Easier for whom, I wondered. I opened the document box and reviewed the papers without trembling. The deed remained in my name. The trust Edward and I established years ago was still intact. Daniel has always assumed that what belongs to me will eventually belong to him, without complication. He does not know that ownership can be structured in ways that protect legacy rather than convenience. I sat at Edward's old desk, running my fingers over the worn oak surface, and remembered a conversation we had the year Daniel turned 40. Edward had looked at me and said, "If our son ever forgets what this house represents, promise me you will remind him." Not with anger, with clarity. I folded the papers carefully and returned them to their place, aligning the box precisely as it had been. Outside, the sun began to rise, casting a pale gold light across the hardwood floors. I did not feel hurt in that moment. I felt awake. The toast from the night before was not simply a careless joke. It was a signal. They were preparing for a future. That required my absence. And I was preparing for a future that required my foresight. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and reached for my phone. There is a certain strength that comes with age, a steadiness earned through decades of keeping promises. If Daniel believes I am holding on to his father's house, then he is about to learn the difference between holding on and holding something in trust. At 8:15 that morning, I called the only person Daniel has always underestimated, my attorney, Charles Bennett, who has known this family almost as long as Edward and I were married. His office sits 3 miles inland in a brick building with narrow windows and a brass plaque that has not changed in 20 years. When he answered, his voice was calm, familiar, unhurried. I told him I would like to review my estate documents in person. I did not explain why. I did not need to. By 10:30, I was seated across from him in a leather chair that made a soft sigh when I settled into it, the scent of old paper and polished wood filling the room. Charles removed his glasses and looked at me carefully, the way a good attorney listens before he speaks. I described the birthday dinner without embellishment. I repeated Daniel's toast exactly as it was said. Charles did not react with outrage. He nodded once, slowly, as if placing a chess piece on a board only he could fully see. He opened the folder containing the trust Edward and I had established 15 years ago, when Daniel was still grateful and eager and convinced that family meant permanence. The structure was simple then. Upon my passing, the house would transfer directly to Daniel. There were no restrictions, no safeguards. We had trusted love to be enough. Charles explained, in measured language, that the trust could be amended while I am alive and competent. The property could remain protected within the trust with specific terms. It could prohibit immediate sale. It could require occupancy for a certain number of years. It could even designate a secondary beneficiary if the primary one failed to meet clear conditions. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I thought about the fireproof box slightly out of place. I thought about Laura's careful questions about maintenance costs and assisted living facilities. 30 miles away, they were not planning for my comfort. They were planning for liquidity. I asked Charles one question. How do I ensure that Edward's home remains Edward's home, not a quick transaction? He slid a legal pad toward me and began outlining options in steady handwriting. A revised trust, a preservation clause, a requirement that any sale proceeds remain in a restricted account benefiting the grandchildren's education, not discretionary spending. The law, I realized, is simply clarity written down. On the drive back home, I passed the elementary school Daniel once attended. The playground looked smaller than I remembered, the basketball hoop lower than it had seemed when he was 12 and believed he would play professionally. Time has a way of shrinking illusions. When I turned into my driveway, the Atlantic breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed, and I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Inside the house, I walked from room to room, not to say goodbye, but to take inventory. The living room with the bay window facing east. The dining room where Edward carved Thanksgiving turkey for 35 consecutive years. The study where the original blueprints are still rolled in a cardboard tube. This house has survived nor'easters with winds reaching 60 miles per hour. It has survived market recessions and personal losses. It will survive a son's impatience. That afternoon, I received a text from Daniel asking if I had given more thought to downsizing. The message was polite. It included a link to a luxury senior condominium complex 15 miles away. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I placed the revised documents Charles had prepared on my desk and read each line carefully, making certain every word reflected intention, not emotion. If Daniel believes I am clinging, then he will soon discover that what I am actually doing is anchoring. And there is a difference between a chain that binds and an anchor that protects. Daniel came by that Saturday just after noon, unannounced but not unexpected, his sedan pulling into the driveway with the slow confidence of someone who believes he already knows the outcome of a conversation. I watched him through the living room window as he stepped out, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, his shoulders slightly tense in a way that betrayed more than his polite smile ever would. I opened the door before he could ring the bell. He kissed my cheek, brief and distracted, and commented on the breeze coming in from the ocean as if we were strangers discussing the weather. Inside, he walked through the foyer with an appraising glance that did not go unnoticed. His eyes lingered on the staircase railing. Edward refinished himself, on the hardwood floors that still shine because I polish them twice a month, on the crown molding that frames the ceiling like quiet history. We sat at the kitchen table where he once did his homework, and I poured him coffee in the same ceramic mug he used in high school. He did not drink it. Instead, he folded his hands and spoke in the careful tone of a man who believes he is being reasonable. He mentioned the condominium complex again, describing its elevators and fitness center and maintenance-free lifestyle, as if convenience were the highest form of comfort. He spoke about property taxes rising 12% over the past 5 years, about heating costs for a 3,000-square-foot home during harsh New England winters, about the practicality of simplifying at my age. I listened without interrupting, my back straight, my hands resting calmly on the table. When he finished, I asked him one question. "Why are you in such a hurry?" He blinked, surprised, then laughed lightly as if the question were harmless. He said there was no hurry, only concern. But concern does not measure square footage or calculate resale value in the middle of a birthday toast. Concern does not browse real estate listings 15 miles away and forward them within hours. I stood and walked to the hallway, gesturing for him to follow. We stopped in the study, and I opened the cabinet where the fireproof box rests. I did not hand it to him. I simply looked at it, then back at my son. "This house," I said quietly, "has been paid off for 23 years. It costs less to maintain than you imagine. What it holds cannot be measured in market trends." Daniel's expression shifted, irritation flickering across his face before settling into something colder. He said I was being sentimental. He said Dad would not want me alone in such a large place. I almost smiled at that. Edward never feared square footage. He feared forgetfulness. I stepped closer to the window, looking out at the Atlantic stretching 5 miles beyond the shore, steady and unmoved by temporary storms. I told Daniel I had met with Charles Bennett. I told him I had reviewed the trust. I did not elaborate. I did not threaten. I simply stated that the house would remain exactly where it has stood since 1974, protected in ways he does not yet understand. Silence settled between us, heavier than any argument. Daniel looked around the room once more, but this time not with calculation, with uncertainty. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that I was not clinging. I was deciding. And there is a quiet authority in a decision already made. Daniel left that afternoon without finishing his coffee, the front door closing with a careful click that sounded more deliberate than polite, and I stood in the foyer for a moment listening to the echo fade through the hallway, measuring the silence the way one measures distance after a storm has passed. I did not feel victorious. I felt certain. That evening the house seemed larger, not emptier, just clearer, as if the walls themselves understood that something fundamental had shifted. I prepared a simple dinner for myself, baked salmon with lemon and a small baked potato, and ate at the dining room table instead of the kitchen counter, the same place where Edward once insisted that every meal, no matter how small, deserved dignity. After I cleared the dishes, I sat in the living room and allowed memory to come without resistance. I remember Daniel at 8 years old building a model sailboat on the carpet, glue on his fingers, determination in his eyes. I remember teaching him how to ride a bicycle in the driveway, running behind him for nearly 50 yards before letting go, watching him wobble forward without realizing he was suddenly on his own. Parenthood, I realized, is a lifelong practice of releasing at the right moment. But there is a difference between releasing and surrendering. Late that night, my phone vibrated with a message from Laura. Her tone was softer than Daniel's, almost sympathetic. She wrote that she hoped I would reconsider, that they were only thinking about my comfort and safety. Safety. I glanced around the room at the smoke detectors Edward installed himself, at the sturdy oak staircase with railings reinforced after his knee surgery, at the emergency numbers taped neatly inside the pantry door. This house has been adapted to life's realities more than once. I typed a brief reply thanking her for her concern and telling her I had made arrangements that ensured everything would be handled responsibly. I did not explain further. The next morning I drove back to Charles Bennett's office and signed the amended trust documents. The preservation clause was precise. The house would remain in trust during my lifetime and could not be sold without unanimous agreement from designated trustees. Upon my passing, Daniel would not receive direct ownership, but rather a structured interest subject to specific conditions, including maintaining the property for a minimum of 10 years or allocating any sale proceeds into an educational fund for his children. It was not punishment. It was protection. When I placed my signature on the final page, my hand did not tremble. Age has thinned my skin, but not my resolve. On my way home, I stopped at the harbor overlook and stepped out of the car, letting the wind brush against my face. The Atlantic stretched wide and steady, indifferent to human impatience. I thought about the birthday toast again, about the laughter that did not know where to land. They had mistaken stillness for weakness. They had mistaken sentiment for fragility. What they did not understand is that a woman who has lived 86 years has already weathered losses far heavier than a careless joke. I returned home and placed a copy of the updated documents in the fireproof box, aligning it carefully in the center of the shelf. The house felt calm around me, not defensive, not threatened, simply anchored. If Daniel believes he was waiting for me to let go, he will soon learn that I was never holding on to him. I was holding on to the promise his father made, and promises, unlike property, are not subject to market value. 2 days after I signed the amended trust, Daniel called in the early evening, his voice measured but strained beneath the surface, the way it used to sound when he was a teenager trying to explain a poor grade before I saw the report card myself. He said he had spoken with Charles Bennett. He said he was surprised. I stood at the kitchen counter, drying a porcelain plate with slow, deliberate movements, and listened without interrupting. He told me the new terms felt unnecessary, that they implied a lack of trust. I let the word settle between us. Trust. It is a fragile thing to accuse someone else of lacking when you have just attempted to rearrange their future without their knowledge. I told him calmly that the documents did not remove him from my life. They clarified the stewardship of a property that has been in this family since 1974. I reminded him that Edward and I built this house from a set of blueprints rolled out across this very table, measuring every inch, calculating every beam. 3,000 square feet do not appear by accident. They are earned one mortgage payment at a time. Daniel grew quiet, and in that quiet I could hear something unfamiliar. Not anger, not entitlement, uncertainty. He asked if Laura had done something to offend me. I almost smiled at that. Laura did not need to offend me. She only needed to assume that my age had softened my awareness. I told Daniel that age has sharpened it, that I notice when the document box is moved 2 inches to the left, that I notice when conversations about safety begin to include square footage and resale value, that I notice when my 86th birthday becomes a platform for public suggestion. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight he had not admitted carrying. He said he was worried about maintenance costs and long winters and icy steps. I thanked him for his concern and explained that I had already arranged for seasonal inspections, snow removal contracts, and a local handyman who lives less than 2 miles away. Preparation is not fear. It is foresight. After the call ended, I stepped onto the back porch and looked out at the Atlantic, the evening light stretching across the water in a silver ribbon nearly 5 miles long. The air carried the cool promise of autumn, and I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, not because I felt fragile, but because I respect the weather. Inside, the house hummed softly with its usual sounds, the refrigerator motor cycling on, the old clock in the hallway marking each second without drama. I thought about Daniel as a boy standing at the edge of this same porch, afraid to jump the final 2 feet to the grass until I assured him he could land on his own. He did land. He always did. But somewhere along the way he confused inheritance with inevitability. The amended trust is not a punishment. It is a lesson written in legal language. Ownership is not assumed. It is honored. Later that night, I placed the updated documents back into the fireproof box and locked it with a steady hand. The house did not feel defensive. It felt settled. Like the ocean outside, it does not chase approval. It does not negotiate its shoreline every time the tide shifts. It remains where it was built, anchored by beams and by promises. If Daniel is waiting for me to loosen my grip, he may soon realize that I was never gripping at all. I was simply standing exactly where I have always stood, in the center of the life his father and I created, unmovable not because I am old, but because I am clear. The following Sunday, Emily came by alone, her small blue hatchback pulling into the driveway, just after church hours when the neighborhood usually rests in quiet routine. She stepped out slowly, not with Daniel's urgency or Laura's calculation, but with something gentler, almost hesitant. Emily is 22 now, studying education at a university nearly 90 miles away. Yet when she walked up the front steps, I still saw the little girl who used to press her face against the bay window and wave at fishing boats passing in the distance. I opened the door before she knocked. She hugged me longer than usual, her arms firm, her cheek resting against my shoulder as if measuring whether I was still solid. We sat at the kitchen table where sunlight filtered in through lace curtains, and she wrapped both hands around a mug of chamomile tea even though she did not drink it. She told me her father seemed upset lately. She said there had been arguments at home about money, about refinancing their own house, about market timing. She spoke carefully, not accusing, not defending, just observing. I listened without adding weight to her words. When she paused, she looked at me directly and asked, "Grandma, are you really going to sell the house?" The question carried no demand, only concern. I told her no. I told her the house was secure. I watched her shoulders relax, just slightly. She said she was glad. She said some places should not disappear just because numbers on a screen change. Her voice was quiet but steady, and I realized in that moment that legacy does not travel only downward from parent to child. Sometimes it skips a generation and settles where it is appreciated. I showed her the study, the desk where Edward once balanced checkbooks by hand, the shelf where the fireproof box rests exactly centered. I did not open it. I did not need to. Emily did not ask about documents or clauses. She asked about memories. She asked about the storm in 1982 when waves rose nearly 4 feet above the usual tide line, and Edward stayed awake all night checking the foundation. She asked about Daniel's first bicycle. She asked about the Thanksgiving when the oven broke and we cooked the turkey at the neighbor's house 2 doors down. Memory, not market value. Before she left, she hesitated in the doorway and said something simple. "If you ever need help with anything here, I can come on weekends." 90 miles is not that far. I thanked her and told her I would remember that. After her car disappeared down the street, I stood on the porch and considered the quiet difference between pressure and presence. Daniel had come measuring square footage. Emily had come measuring continuity. That evening my phone remained silent. No new messages about condominiums or resale projections. Just the steady ticking of the hallway clock and the distant rhythm of waves nearly 5 miles out. I realized then that the amended trust was not merely a legal instrument. It was a boundary line drawn clearly and calmly. The house no longer felt like contested ground. It felt chosen. And as the light faded over the Atlantic, I understood something that had taken 86 years to crystallize. Strength does not always raise its voice. Sometimes it simply remains, unmoved, until others learn to adjust around it. 3 evenings after Emily's visit, Daniel asked if he could come by again, this time with Laura, and I agreed without hesitation because clarity does not avoid daylight. They arrived just before sunset, when the sky over the Atlantic turns a pale rose color and the air carries that early autumn crispness that reminds you seasons move forward whether you approve or not. Laura brought a bakery pie, apple with a lattice crust, the kind that looks thoughtful but calculated, and she placed it carefully on my kitchen counter as if staging goodwill. We sat in the living room instead of the kitchen, the three of us arranged across from one another like negotiators who have agreed to keep their voices low. Daniel began by saying he had overreacted after speaking with Charles Bennett. He admitted he had assumed the house would naturally transfer to him without conditions. Laura added that they had been planning renovations to their own property and had counted on future equity, her tone measured but revealing more than she intended. I listened without judgment, my hands folded in my lap, the pearls at my throat cool against my skin. I told them the amended trust was not designed to punish or exclude, but to preserve intention. Edward and I did not build this house as a placeholder asset. We built it as a foundation. There is a difference. Daniel looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the framed photograph above the fireplace, the one of him at 12 years old holding a striped base nearly 24 inches long, grinning beside his father on the dock less than a mile from here. He said he remembered that morning clearly. I said so did I. I reminded him that foundations are meant to support, not to be dismantled at the first sign of opportunity. Laura asked quietly what the new terms required. I explained them simply. The house remains in trust during my lifetime. After I am gone, it cannot be sold immediately for convenience. It must either be maintained for a decade or any proceeds must be directed toward the grandchildren's education. Not vacations. Not remodels. Education. Silence settled again, but this time it felt different, less combative, more contemplative. Daniel exhaled and admitted he had not considered how his birthday toast might have sounded. He said he thought humor would soften the subject. I met his eyes steadily and told him humor is safest when it does not target someone's dignity. Laura lowered her gaze, and for a moment I saw not calculation but recognition. The ocean outside moved steadily, waves breaking nearly 5 miles out in their usual rhythm, indifferent to human impatience. I stood and walked to the window, not to dramatize the moment, but because the light was fading and I prefer to watch it. I told them this house has endured storms with winds exceeding 60 miles per hour. It has endured loss and quiet and long winters. It does not need rescue. It needs respect. When I turned back toward them, I saw something had shifted. Not surrender. Not resentment. Awareness. Daniel nodded slowly and said he understood. Whether he fully did or not will reveal itself over time, but acknowledgement is a beginning. Laura suggested perhaps we could host Thanksgiving here again this year, the way we used to. I considered it carefully, then agreed. Traditions do not disappear unless someone abandons them. As they left that evening, the sky had deepened into indigo, and the porch light cast a warm circle across the steps. I closed the door gently behind them and felt the house settle into its familiar quiet. The trust was signed. The boundaries were clear. What remains now is not negotiation, but alignment. And alignment, like the tide, may take time, but it always finds its level. Thanksgiving arrived with a cold, bright morning that made the Atlantic look almost metallic, the water stretching nearly 5 miles out under a sky so clear it felt deliberate. I woke before sunrise, as I always do, and stood in the kitchen tying on the same cream-colored apron I have worn for decades, the fabric thin at the edges but still strong at the seams. By 8 o'clock the turkey was in the oven, 18 pounds seasoned the way Edward preferred, slow roasted and steady, no shortcuts. The house carried the scent of sage and butter, and for the first time in weeks, it did not feel like contested ground. It felt claimed. Around noon Daniel and Laura arrived with the children, their footsteps lighter than the last time they crossed this threshold. Emily hugged me first, longer than necessary, and whispered that she was glad we were here. The table was set in the dining room, polished silver laid out carefully, crystal glasses aligned with quiet precision. I had placed Edward's old carving knife at the head of the table, not as a relic, but as continuity. When everyone was seated, there was a brief, almost ceremonial pause before Daniel stood. My heart did not race. I did not brace myself. I simply watched. He cleared his throat and lifted his glass. This time there was no slur, no careless humor. He said he wanted to thank me for hosting, for keeping traditions alive, for building a home that had carried him through childhood and into adulthood. He did not mention the trust. He did not mention market value. He mentioned memory. The room remained quiet, but it was not the uneasy silence from my birthday dinner. It was attentive. When he finished, He looked at me, not past me. I stood slowly, feeling the familiar strength in my spine that comes from years of standing when it matters. I lifted my own glass and met his gaze without hesitation. I said that a house is not something you let go of when it becomes inconvenient. It is something you protect when it becomes important. I said that holding on and holding accountable are not the same thing. I told him I was never refusing to let go of his father's house. I was refusing to let go of the promise that built it. There was no applause. There did not need to be. The truth settled across the table more solidly than any decoration. Laura nodded once, quietly. Emily smiled in that steady way of hers. The grandchildren returned to their mashed potatoes, unaware that something invisible had just realigned. After dinner, Daniel helped me clear the plates without being asked. He rinsed them carefully, the way Edward once taught him, and for a moment I saw the boy who had built model sailboats on this floor decades ago. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry leaves along the porch, but the foundation beneath us did not shift. Later that evening, when the house grew quiet again and the dishes were stacked neatly in the cabinet, I stood by the bay window and looked out at the dark Atlantic. The tide moved in its steady rhythm, neither rushed nor delayed. I understood then that the trust had done more than secure property. It had clarified respect. Daniel may have believed I was clinging to something outdated. Instead, I had been anchoring something enduring. And as the night settled over the water and the lights of distant boats flickered nearly 5 miles offshore, I felt no need to prove anything further. The house remained. The promise remained. And so did I.